Okay. I'll also, since it's just me tonight, I'll every once in a while take a look at the comments. So again, try and just talk. There's only 11 of us tonight, so that's good. It's a little bit more free to just voice any questions that you have. But if you want to put in the comments, I'll check in there every once in a while as well. Okay, started in the middle, my bad. So, first of all, I just want to say happy Arbor Day. I chose today, of course, for this because I thought what a great fit. So today, if you did not know, is Arbor Day. I saw a few groups doing tree planting, so that's really awesome. So we're going to talk about some Western New York trees today. So I'll just give you a brief intro about myself, and then we'll talk about tree anatomy, a little bit more about New York forests, and some statistics about forests in New York. Then we'll look at a description of some Western New York trees, how to identify trees, especially seasonally. We'll look at just a few tree diseases as well and how to look out for those. And then I'll talk a bit about the tree guide, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So my name is Abigail. I already mentioned that. I'm the education manager at Impact Earth. I did my undergraduate for anthropology at SUNY Brockport. And then I went to Canada and I did my, my master's at the University of Saskatchewan. And I did that in environmental anthropology. So a lot of people, it's a very unique niche schooling I went for. But basically, I found that my main interest in anthropology was environmental and indigenous rights. So really what that means is I study, or I did study how humans interact with the environment and kind of the effects that we have both on the environment and then the environment's effect on us. So a lot of pre-undergraduate, I also did a lot of classes in botany and greenhouse management and a lot of those. So that's kind of where my background is, at least academically, in plants and tree identification. But most of it is in practice. I used to just walk around Highland Cemetery and just study trees in the winter. So that's really where a lot of my knowledge comes from, is just a personal love for trees. And so just studying it on my own time. So we're going to get right into tree anatomy. So here's a nice little diagram of what a tree looks like, both above ground and underground. So you probably know some of these basics, and some might be new terms, but starting right at the bottom are its roots. There's also a taproot, and a taproot is the main root that goes straight directly down, and that's kind of its anchor point. So roots have a few different functions. The main function is that they're used to, well, one of the main functions is that they're used as an anchoring or a stability for the tree. So as there's windstorms and other, effects up above, that's that support system. And they usually can, some trees get even taller in depth underground than the tree itself above ground, both vertically or horizontally. So roots are a really interesting part of tree anatomy. They're invisible to the eye, so we don't get to see much of it, but it's a very awesome system. The other aspects of roots is that they collect all of the water and nutrients for the tree. And we'll go a little bit more into how it makes its way up the tree as well, and how the tree can get all of that water and nutrients to every inch of it. So they collect from below as well. And then the last main part about a root is that it also is a communication for other trees. So that's a really fascinating part about trees, is that they can communicate with each other. And the main reason for doing that is just to let other trees know if there might be a bug or disease or wind or things like that. They'll be able to communicate, and usually they have some type of like fighting off method that they can then spend all of their energy on combating whatever that may be. So the roots are a really fascinating part of the tree. Next up is what you call a bole. That one is a little bit new of a term for most people, and it's not used very often because it simply is just the section of the trunk that is before the limbs come up. So that basically identifies a tree between a shrub. Although some trees like to start their limbs right from the ground. So that is one of those tricky parts, because you would think, oh, maybe that's a shrub. But in fact, some of them, that bole is either non-existent or maybe just below the soil level. But a bole is just that chunk before any tree limbs start. So then there's, of course, the trunk, and then we'll look a little bit more into what a trunk entails in the next slide. And then we have our tree, or our limbs, our branches, and our twigs. So they're a great support system as well. They allow the trees to get more light by growing outward or upward, however the tree may grow. And they, of course, hold all of their leaves. And they're also the canopy or the crown, and all of those branches support a lot of other a whole nother ecosystem. So a lot of other birds and other types of animals live up in trees, which is really awesome too. It's like a whole nother ecosystem. And the last is the crown. And the crown is that canopy that I mentioned of trees growing up to break through that canopy to reach the light, which they need to survive as well. So we're going to go into the trunk. So there's a few different pieces of a trunk. So the outside would be the bark. That's like our skin. It's their protective layer. The bark is a very delicate yet also sturdy portion of the tree. So what I mean by that is, for example, a beech tree. You may see in a beech tree that people like to mark their names and kind of sketch into a tree. It looks very cool and it's very fun to do, but it's actually really dangerous for the tree. And that is because right behind that bark layer is the xylem and phloem, which is the main source of food and water for the tree. So if those get cut off, or so for example, say you cut a ring around the bark and you scraped through that actually would, because the xylem and phloem are moving up and down throughout the tree, that could actually break the xylem and phloem, and the xylem and phloem wouldn't be able to move the food and the water up and down the tree, and you could instantly kill a tree that way. Of course, you might not be able to see it because trees could be standing up dead for many years. But that's why I always recommend for people not to scrape into trees. I've never known someone to do it, but you see them all around. But that just shows how delicate the bark is, but also how important it is for the tree's life. So the bark is just their protection, and we'll look at I really love bark because it's a fun way to identify trees. It tends to be one of the more difficult ones, but it's really fun to do that in the winter, is just go around and try and identify a tree just by its bark. So we'll look at some other examples. So then we get past the bark, we get to the xylem and the phloem. So those are the veins, if you will, of food source. So I have these arrows just to show how that flows up and down the tree. So if you think about, so the water starts from its roots, then it travels up through the xylem and then exits through the leaves. And then as that happens, the food, which is the nutrients and the sunlight and everything else, that the leaves, they make up all that food. They then travel downward and give the rest of that nutrients, all that food to the rest of the tree. So you can kind of think of it like a circle. And if the water is not flowing upward, then the food is not flowing downwards. So they need both the xylem and phloem to be functioning for a tree to get all of the water and nutrients that it needs to every inch of its of the tree itself. So xylem and phloem is a really, really cool part of the tree. And then we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide because it has to do with the leaves as well. Then next is the cambium, which is just like a thin layer of tree. That's actually where the new cells of a tree grow. So most of you probably know about tree rings, and that's the dead tree, the old growth of a tree. That's how you can identify its age, by its rings. So the cambium is growing its new, as it's growing its new cells, it's shedding its old cells backwards, and that's how those rings develop. So the cambium is very, very thin, couple inches, they say, of a soft tree, and then it's growing backwards. And then that pith is the center of the tree. It's that first ring of growth. So does anyone have questions about the trunk of a tree or the slide before? Let's take a look. Okay. All right. So next, oops, not too far. Okay, so next is the fruit and the leaves. So the fruit is simply just a transport of seeds, actually. So it's just a way that that animals can get attracted to grabbing that fruit, and then they end up transporting seeds in throughout the forest, so they can make their way a lot further than a tree just maybe dropping their seeds right down. There's other ways that trees will transport their seeds, and that's through, like, you could think of like the maple with the helicopter seed. So that usually they use wind if they're not using fruit to transport their seeds. And then there's the leaf. So the leaf is also really awesome. So they have first the veins, and that's the vascular bundle that has the xylem and phloem in it. And then there's something called a stoma. And a stoma is basically a little hole that opens and closes when water and to breathe the CO2 in. So what happens is when it opens, it'll actually take in the CO2, and it also will take in some water sometimes as well. But then that's also where the oxygen releases from a leaf. So that stoma, as they open and close, they kind of regulate also the vascular bundles of a tree. And so that xylem and phloem can travel up and down through the rest of the tree. So it's just an awesome part. I love leaves and the importance that they have. So of course, when we think of deciduous, those leaves end up falling off. And when that happens, they're obviously don't have any stoma, and they don't have those veins going all the way through to the leaves. So that's kind of the dormant stage of a deciduous tree, where they're usually just storing up any nutrients that they're getting. So it kind of is some would say their weaker part. It's not when they're growing, they're just stagnant. They just sit and wait in the winter time. And there's just a whole lot of fun, interesting facts about, or studies about how trees communicate to get ready for the the summer and the springtime, they actually, it's like they have a weather system in and of themselves. So they kind of know the weather before we do at times too. So New York forests, there is 61% of New York state land is forested land. This is quite a bit. We are one of the states that have a lot of forest coverage. If you can even just imagine how large our state parks are as well. So it's about 50% of that. I think it's 53% of the forested land is state forest area. So that doesn't mean that it's all parks, but that some of it is just maintained by New York State as well. And then the rest of it ends up being private and privately owned, and I think some publicly owned forest land as well. And then within those forests, there's over 100 species of trees. They're both commercial and non-commercial. So what that means is commercial is typically going to be trees that are not native. It doesn't mean they aren't. Some of those hardwood trees are going to be native to the area, but they tend to just grow them to cut them down and use for lumber and paper and any of those type of goods. And then the non-commercial trees are going to be the native trees as well as oriental trees that have been brought into the state just based on either their strength and durability, or sometimes it's mainly just for their appearance, that they're very beautiful and unique trees. So that's going to be the difference between commercial and non-commercial. And the most common forest types that we see are deciduous. We do have obviously a lot of evergreen, but the majority, which I was a little bit surprised about, is deciduous forests. And then within the deciduous forests, it's mainly going to be maple, birch, and beech trees. So maples, most everyone can identify. Birch, there's usually a few different types of birch, and they tend to have their own distinct identification that's usually through their bark. And then beech trees, which also have a very distinct smooth bark, but they also keep that picture is a great picture to show that a lot of them keep their leaves on in the winter time. And it's really actually pretty to be by them in the winter when the wind blows, because they have a very beautiful sound to them too. So I briefly brought this up already, but I will briefly go over the deciduous and evergreen difference. So deciduous trees are trees that drop their leaves every fall, and then so they become bare for the winter months, whereas evergreens keep their foliage all year, giving them the term that evergreen, because they're green all the time. There are a couple evergreens that drop their needles, but I think there's only one or two species, and I'm forgetting the names of them right now, in New York State that actually do that. I think there's only one, but there might be two. So that's the difference between evergreen and deciduous. So before we get into identifying, we're going to look at why trees are so valuable. So I really love this. I found this on the DEC website. I found why they're so valuable to humans. And I just thought this was really fascinating. And I do have the link. I have anything that I got off, I have like a link of, and I can share that when I do share the tree identification resource. I can share those links in the bottom if that's if people want to take a look at this more. But I'm gonna actually read through how they came up with these, or the brief kind of synopsis of how they came up with these, because I just find it very, very interesting. So it says boost the immune system. While we breathe in fresh air, we breathe in phytoncides. So I don't know some of this stuff. If you can tell, this is the new stuff to me when I was researching this stuff. But so airborne chemicals that plants give off to protect themselves from insects. The phytoncides have antibacterial and antifungal qualities, which help plants fight disease. When people breathe in these chemicals, our bodies respond by increasing the number and activity of a type of a white blood cell called natural killer cells, or NK. These cells kill tumor and virus infected cells in our bodies. In one study, increased NK activity from a 3-day, 2-night forest bathing trip lasted for more than 30 days. Japanese researchers are currently exploring whether exposure to forests can help prevent certain kinds of cancer. So already that first one, like I absolutely love that. And I just find that super fascinating. So spending time around trees and looking at trees reduces stress, lowers blood pressure, and improves mood. Numerous studies show that both exercising in forests and simply sitting looking at trees reduce blood pressure, as well as the stress-related hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. Looking at pictures of trees has a similar but less dramatic effect. Studies examining the same activities in urban, unplanted areas showed no reduction of stress-related effects. Using the profile of mood states test, which I'll have to look into after all of this, researchers found that forest bathing tips significantly decreased the scores of anxiety, depression, anger, confusion, and fatigue. And because stress inhibits the immune system, the stress reduction benefits of forests are further magnified. Green spaces in urban areas are just as important as rural forests. About 85% of the US population lives in suburban and urban areas and may not have access to traditional rural forests. That's okay. Gardens, parks, and street trees make up what is called an urban and community forest. These pockets of green space are vitally important because they are the source of daily access to trees. Again, in New York State, we have some really awesome projects for towns being an urban forested and community forest kind of approved. And so you can have a town board of tree advisors, basically. So in Canandaigua specifically, they have a really awesome kind of push for having native trees in the city as well, or in the town, as well as having a wider variety, because that's another issue that we usually have, is that we may have some native trees, but they tend to just be the same species, just a few species, and that's not great. Even in an urban setting, we want variety for the animals that do live there. And it's also shown to help prevent flooding as well. So that's been a big reason why some towns are looking into having these little either community forests or having these these water retention kind of parks, so that it can actually help with flooding as well. So there's some really cool research out there about urban forests as well. Some other parts of this. So spending time in nature helps you focus. Our lives are busier than ever with jobs, school, and family life. Trying to focus on many activities or even a single thing for long periods of time can mentally drain us, a phenomenon called directed attention fatigue. Spending time in nature, looking at plants, water, birds, and other aspects of nature gives the cognitive portion of our brain a break, allowing us to focus better and renew our ability to be patient. In children, attention fatigue causes an inability to pay attention and control impulses. The part of the brain affected by attention fatigue is also involved in attention deficit, so ADHD. Studies show that children who spend time in nature, natural outdoor environments have a reduction in attention fatigue, and children diagnosed with ADHD show a reduction in related symptoms. Researchers are investigating the use of natural outdoor environments to supplement current approaches to managing ADHD. And the last part of this is patients recover from surgery faster and better when they have a green view. Hospital patients may be stressed from a variety of factors, including pain, fear, and disruption of normal routine. Research found that patients with green views had shorter stays, took fewer painkillers, and had slightly fewer post-surgical complications compared to those who had no view or view of a cement wall. And I, just as a side note before we get into it, I also worked at a nursing home in 2020, so right when COVID had started affecting us. And so we had quarantined the residents, and I was working in the activities department. And having the window space, we ended up focusing so much of our time on like they're saying, kind of greening their windows. So we would have bird feeders and we'd be filling those all the time. And we were making sure there was plants nearby, or having family come by and leave plants there as well. So just having that space, again, we focused mainly on that during that time as well, just as like a side note of how valuable nature is for our health, our mental health especially. And then why trees are so valuable for the ecosystem. Forests house 80% of our terrestrial biodiversity. Forests store more than 1 trillion tons of carbon, and then over 40% of the world's oxygen is produced by rainforests. So just some fun facts about trees and why they're so important for the ecosystem. Does anyone have questions again before we go any further? All good. Okay. So a few Western New York trees. These are the ones that I put in the tree guide, and the ones we'll talk about a little bit. So these are what I consider the most common. Of course, I did add in the ones they say are the absolute most common ones. You may notice that I only put one evergreen. It was just based on time of what I wanted to focus on. But I'll probably be adding more trees to this guide as I have time for it. So I'll update that whenever I do, and update it on our website, and I'll explain that later. So the main ones I already brought up were beech, birch, and maple, but then I also added the eastern hemlock. That's a really popular one here that you'll see. You'll see sycamores, dogwoods, shagbark, hickory. Those are really awesome. You'll see oak trees and magnolia trees. I think I added a few more even from this list as well. Okay, so before we get into identifying, here's how to identify trees seasonally. So I like this as a challenge. If you're going to start to kind of do this as like a hobby, I would say that definitely pay attention to identifying trees in every season. It's really fun to do it, and it can be challenging, and it makes you have to identify trees not with just one piece. So for example, a maple tree, we all can identify a maple tree because of its leaf, if we look at that. So if you try and identify maples in the winter time or even in the springtime, it's going to be a little bit more challenging because we can't look for that very distinct leaf. So it's really fun to kind of challenge yourself. So what you're looking out for is obviously the leaves. You're looking at the bark. And then you're also looking at the shape, which I really like to use, because say you're driving in a car, over time you end up being able to identify some trees just by driving past and seeing that very distinct shape that they have. So that's fun as well. And then you're also looking at the seeds, and you're looking at the buds in the beginning in springtime right now, the flowers, the fruit. So there's definitely other identifiers, but these three are the main ones that I look at. And then just looking at all 4 seasons for us. So the springtime is a great way to use the flowers to identify trees. It's also just a beautiful time to go out and look at look at trees also because of the scent as well. This is going to be the most scent you'll get from deciduous trees. And then in the fall is when you get more scents from the evergreens as well. But springtime is really fun for just the beauty of the flowers. So then summertime is a great time to identify trees, especially if you're beginning it, because you're starting off, because you can use absolutely everything to identify, because there's going to be leaves, the bark, the shape, the flowers is the only thing that's not going to be there, but it's absolutely the best time to go out and try and identify trees. So the fall time is, again, it's pretty much the same. You do have almost everything still in the fall time, but what's fun obviously is that you get to see that changing color of a lot of the deciduous trees. And then like I brought up before, is you can even identify some evergreens by their scents as well. And then the winter time, you have the bark. So it's the most difficult season, but like I said, it's really fun because it's just a great challenge. And sometimes I'll just identify, I'll use the bark and be like, I'm not sure, but I'll come back to this tree in a few months and maybe my guesses will be right, or I'll be able to analyze it a little more and be able to find out what tree that really is. The other thing that you could do, especially if there's no snow on the ground and it's still winter time, you could use the leaves that have fallen. So usually there's going to be a layer of different leaves on the ground, so it makes it a little bit more challenging. But if I'm stuck on a tree and I can't figure out what that is just by the bark, I'll look at the forest floor and I'll look at the leaves that I have available. And then usually you can figure out what tree it is just because of those old leaves on the ground. So that's a fun kind of trick to the winter time. All right, we'll look at a few tree diseases as well, and then we'll get into some of these distinct trees. So this one I just actually saw last week. And so I put this in, even though on the DEC website, they don't have this marked as a disease, or at least one that you would see around. So it's blight. And I saw it on a blue cedar tree at Highland Park. And so this type of blight affects cedar and hemlock trees. And what happens is the needles first will start to turn yellow or pink. So the one that I saw, the blue spruce, actually turned pink. And it is quite beautiful, but sad, because I was looking at it and thinking this has to be some type of disease. But if you went close, it really was just a change of a few needles. And that pink looked so pretty. It wasn't like a yellowing or it didn't look weak from it. But basically that's the start of the blight. So it'll change up all of those, the needles will start to go to an off color. And then the limbs will begin to fall off, and then usually the tree will end up dying. So it takes quite a while for trees to die of a disease, not like a beetle. Beetles are quicker. But it does take some time for that. So at that point, that the tree was at a stage where it probably has quite some more time. So I did look into this, and they say that you could try and save the tree by changing the soil around the tree, but that would be quite difficult to save it. Most trees are going to have a hard time to come back from most diseases. Some people will end up getting help from like a Cornell group or some other college nearby to see if they can save the tree, but most times trees do have to be removed or they just end up dying. So that's the first one. This other one I've seen a lot around is the Asian longhorn beetle. So that first picture, these are all pictures on the DEC website, but that first picture is an example of how big the hole is that they make when they're crawling and getting past that trunk. So that without the pencil, I've seen a lot of those really large holes. The other holes are going to be some smaller beetles that you probably have heard of, and they make very distinct kind of perfectly, like holes just perfectly right next to each other. And that's going to be some other beetles, some pine beetles and other kinds. So the Asian longhorn beetle affects hardwoods such as birch, maple, willow, poplar, elm, and some others. The only recommendations they had were to check your pool filters, which I had not thought of before. So that's a great example of, or a great idea to check your pool filters for any of these beetles and try to trap them. And then also transporting firewood through state lines. So that's the main reason why they ask you not to transport woods, because you're just a lot of times, or it's high potential that you could transport beetles and invasive species to other trees and other forests as well. So those are kind of the two things that you could do to prevent this. But the longhorn beetle will get into the tree. And like I said, once that bark is weakened, even a little bit, it allows for other diseases to get in. And it weakens that tree really aggressively. The last one is kind of a little bit newer to our area. I haven't seen one here. I saw one in New Jersey just last year. They're absolutely beautiful, but unfortunately they're very bad for our trees. So they're the spotted lanternfly. They're gorgeous, and you'll see either the black spots or some of them have white spots. I think that's the earlier kind of the larva stage. They have white spots, I believe. But they're native to Asia, and they affect maple, walnut, and fruit trees mainly, and then I think some vines as well. So what they do is they'll lay eggs. So it's hard to see in this picture, but basically they kind of lay these egg like masses. So it's just this giant bulge on the side of the tree, different than a boral, whereas a boral is a big kind of blob of cells that a tree grows to protect itself from a wound. But it's just going to try and blend into the trunk, but it's just this big bulge that's on the side of the tree. So they will lay eggs, and then they also will suck on the sap from the trees. And what that does is, again, similar to the trunk, it leaves the tree more weak because it's sucking its nutrients out. And then it exposes the tree to other diseases where usually they'll get in pretty quick and then take the tree. So the only recommendation, or because this is a newer bug that's coming in, at least up in New York, they're still doing studies on how to prevent and how to save trees. But what they do say that you could do is, if you see an egg mass, if you're up to the challenge, you could scrape that mass right actually off of the tree. And they say to put it in a bucket with hot soapy water. So that's a very interesting disease I find, or bug that I find that's getting. So hopefully we don't see many more, but usually once they're down further in some other states, they tend to make their way a couple years up here. And I've heard that some people have seen this lanternfly already up in New York too. So we're at the end of the tree diseases. Does anyone have any questions before we go into some IDing and looking at the book? All good? Okay. I haven't looked at the comments actually. Let me just make sure. Okay, all good. All right. I hope everyone is enjoying this and learning some stuff as well. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Okay, so here's an example of I don't like this slide, but here's a small example of what it is. So we're going to go into the actual tree guide in a second. But what I did so far is I've just drawn out the main identifying points to each tree. So I like doing it this way. I also recommend that people start a tree journal if you're going to start walking around and looking at trees. because you're able to kind of sketch out some of the main points of a tree. I love the books with pictures, and it's a great like using a tree identifier of Western New York. They're really awesome, but there's also a really valuable thing to just a black and white image. I like that for looking at the shapes of the trees, especially because I find it's just really easy to tell. It's really easy to tell what tree it is if you just have that kind of that main sketch of the tree shape. So that's why I wrote this one. A very important thing to me is keep a tree journal, because it you can keep track of all these things. Here, I'm going to exit out of this presentation, but it's really great to just keep track of all the trees and even where you're finding them too, because that way you can go back into it. Okay, I can't do presentation mode, unfortunately, for this one, but we're just kind of going to go through all of the trees. So for now, this is what I have for the tree guide, but when I send it to all of you, I'll add a little bit more to it. I want to add kind of a map to show you some places that you can even have some of the arboretums near us that you can use that actually have the names of the trees on there. I'm going to add also the genus species in here, and then some other main points about each of the trees. So this is kind of just a rough beginning to it, but it's got all the main points in there. One sec. So the blight, and it actually infects it from within. So that's why I believe they said to John's question, he's asking about the Syracocus. I cannot pronounce it. The blight. So that I believe the reason it infects like from the roots in, because that's why they're saying to change up the soil, because maybe you can get the blight out. But then that's why it's really, really difficult, because once it gets in, it's actually going through the veins, and that's why the needles are changing slowly, and then the limbs come off. It's because it's roots and then to the branches, basically. So it infects from the roots upward. All right, so first we have the tulip tree. This is a very large tree. Those are the other points that I'm going to add in there, but we'll just talk through them tonight. So the tulip tree is very large. What you're going to see right now, actually, which is really pretty, is if you go out and see some of the budding or the seeds that are growing, what it looks like is it actually looks like a tulip, but it's all these dried. It's like a brown look to it. And that's its seed pod. So it's producing its seed pod right now to spread all of its growth. But it's this just gorgeous, like tulip looking seed pod. And then once it sheds that, it basically drops it down. So it kind of looks like an umbrella afterwards. And then what you're going to find is this shaped leaf, which is very distinct. We have quite a bit of tulip trees in our area, so you're going to find them at most parks. And then the bark is going to be not as scaly. So when I say scaly, it's just not going to have these thick pieces. It's going to be a little bit thinner and smoother. But its main distinction is going to be in the springtime, it's seed pods, and then also the height. So it reaches similar to like a hickory or a sycamore. They're very tall trees. So this is a very gorgeous tree. Next is the sycamore. The sycamore has an awesome trunk. It looks like layers of green, brown, and red circular scales. So that's the easiest way to identify a sycamore, is through its trunk. If you notice, the leaf is quite similar to a maple. So although the maple is very distinct, you would know the difference. It's got a similar veins and the 3-prong, whereas a maple has 5. But um, it's a very simple leaf. So although if you'd look at it long enough, you'd be able to identify it. I find that a sycamore is really hard to tell by its leaves. So I just go off of the trunk. Next is a shagbark. I love a shagbark tree. So this one has a compound leaf. A compound leaf has multiple leaves off of one. So this is actually one leaf right here. Although you would look at this and think maybe this is 5. So this has one leaf completely. It's a very distinct leaf, so that's usually a great identifier for a shagbark, but similar to the sycamore, this is the bark is the most distinct part of a shagbark hickory. So it has really, really large scales, and how this works is the bark actually sheds off of the tree. So whereas bark usually stays on, the thickness grows as it ages. The bark of this hickory will shed off of it. So that's why usually you'll see a lot of the shedding of the trunk down below, because there's going to be a lot of pieces. It also makes it very strong. At the house I grew up in, we have a very large shagbark. It's the biggest tree in the neighborhood. And so it's a very distinct, huge tree. It actually got electrocuted and did not die. It's a very strong tree. I don't know how it survived it, but it got electrocuted and affected a lot around. There was a lot of shedding, but it survived that storm, which is really surprising. So that's a really fun bark. There are some other barks that tend to look like it, and it's one of the birch trees. But you'll be able to then identify by the leaf or the size of the tree. Birches are a lot smaller than a shagbark hickory. So that's kind of some of those other ways to single out the shagbark compared to some of the other ones. Next, we have a river birch. So there are a few different birch trees. We have the river birch, we have the yellow birch, and then there's one other birch I think that we have in New York State, but the river birch is the one I decided to share because it is more distinct to me, or I think that we see it more often. So a river birch, by its name, you're going to find it in a marshier, wet forest or by a river. So that's kind of a marker. The area that these trees live in is also a way to identify. So the river birch, it also has somewhat of a shedding bark, but it's like a paper birch almost as well. That's the third one. So the paper birch, river, and yellow. So the river birch has a little bit of shedding to its trunk. It's more green to yellow. So that's kind of the difference between a river birch and a paper birch, which is a little bit more distinctly red. So the leaf also has the pointed, a scaly side, and that's another distinction that's unique to it. And then also, you'll see the shape of the river birch. I brought up the bowl earlier. So its bowl is very small. Sometimes you'd not be able to see it because birch trees have their trunks split really early on. So you'll usually see the base, and there's going to be 3 or more trunks that come out of that bowl. So that's a great way to identify it too. They also have skinnier trunks as well as compared to some other trees. Next, we have the maple tree, a very distinct tree. Most people know this one. So like I said, it's got the 5 wings to the leaf. So that makes it a little bit more distinct than more unique than the sycamore to identify. We have plenty of maple varieties, so I just stuck with maple. There is a Japanese maple, and that's an oriental maple that came in quite some time ago in New York. So it's turned into what people would think is a common tree here. The difference with the Japanese maple is it's a lot skinnier. Its leaf is a lot skinnier, kind of floats in the tree. It's really beautiful. And then usually the tree is a lot smaller than a common maple that you would see here. So the sap is obviously a big thing that people love about a maple tree. So that's why we tap trees, maple trees here. You can actually go to Cummings Nature Center does really good events for tapping as well. So the maple tree, we usually identify with the leaf. It also has a much more scaly bark than some of the others that we've shown. So it doesn't shed like a shagbark, but it's also does not have small veins either. It's got very deep kind of veins that pull in and out. So that's why it's drawn a little bit darker to show depth, because that's a great way to tell between or for a maple as well. It's got a lot more texture to its trunk too. I find that the shape is less distinct because it's usually what we'd consider a little bit more standard of a tree shape. So I typically don't even look at the shape of a maple tree if I'm passing by. So that's just, I threw it in there, but that's, I find that it's a little bit harder to identify a maple by its shape. Next is the magnolia tree. They're blooming right now. So if you have not gone out to see them yet, they'll still be blooming for probably another week or two. But I love magnolia trees. The smell is wonderful. You can go see them at both the Highland Arboretum, and then you can also go see them at the Durand Arboretum too. So if you don't know about that Arboretum, it's really, really beautiful. It's got amazing oriental trees, but it's less known than the Highland Arboretum. And if you don't know, I should say an arboretum is just like a tree zoo, I like to call it, because they have a bunch of oriental and native trees that they've planted, or it started there and then they've added a bunch of oriental trees. A lot of people like to donate trees to arboretums. And so then they'll also have like a little card that you can go up and see what type of tree it is. And then sometimes it says who donated it. But I love arboretums because it's just a huge educational time to go look at trees, and you can guess and then go look at what it actually is. It's really awesome. So they have really nice magnolia trees at the Durand Park as well. It's off of Zoo Road if you're driving down on Durand at the beach. So magnolia trees, there's a few different varieties, but they usually look a little bit, they all have their own distinctness, but the shape of the tree is usually going to be that they split after that bowl. It usually splits one or more. One of the varieties splits really, really low, and it has a bunch of trunks shooting out or limbs shooting out. But they'll have a bunch of, it gets a little bit wider when it grows up, and then those leaves flow over, the flowers and leaves kind of flow over. So they have different sections kind of of its growth. The magnolia leaf is also very beautiful. And so it's a little bit bigger and it's got more of a rounded shape to it. And then the bark I find is similar to a maple. It's going to be a little less distinct. So you're probably not going to be able to, I mean, you could try and identify it, but usually you can identify a magnolia by its shape and in the wintertime. And then in the summer and spring, it's going to be the leaves and the flowers, especially. Here's our one evergreen that I put in here. I love the eastern hemlock tree. It's very, very popular around here. It's very common around here. So you're going to see an eastern hemlocks a lot. You see them with more wetlands or some more marsh areas. You'll see a heavy forest of hemlocks and red pines and things like that, as other evergreens. But an eastern hemlock is very nice to identify by its needles. It's got this non-symmetrical growth of their needles, and it kind of comes out, but this is a very distinct look to what the needles will be like. The trunk is similar to other evergreens, but it's a little bit skinny. It's got some skinnier scales throughout it, and they're long. So that's kind of the best way to identify a hemlock tree. And then the shape of it, I find that the shape of evergreens is the way that I can identify them, because for some reason needles are just counting needles and remembering those is very hard, challenging for me. So I usually go off of the shape. So an eastern hemlock is a very traditional triangle shape. They're tall and skinny, and they have a little draping at the bottom of the tree. But the needles and the shape is like the easiest way to identify an eastern hemlock. We also have really, I will probably add some more evergreens because I really, our spruces are gorgeous, and those drape down more. It usually has a drooping, its limbs are drooping. And then cedars are very distinct by their smell, and also the trunk. The trunk is really, really pretty orange, and it's got more like they almost are like hairy trunks, and they're very fine. The texture is a very unique one. So drawing that out and figuring that out will be a challenge in and of itself. But the cedars are a really beautiful tree here too. Okay, we have a few more trees. So then the dogwood, another, just like the magnolia, it's a very distinct tree because of its flowers here. They will start to flower soon after the magnolias. I don't know if I've seen one flowering yet, but they probably are coming right about now. So their flowers are just the 4 petals. That's how I absolutely know a dogwood is by the 4 petals. They are either going to be white or pink. And I also try and remember that they always flower they're soon after a magnolia. So if I start seeing magnolias, I know to go look out for some dogwood trees too. Their trunk is very cool because it's very small kind of circles and oblong ovals, things like that. The shape of its scales are more circular, and they're really, really close together. So it ends up being like this really circular, scaly trunk. The leaves are very pretty. They have a nice point. It's a smooth edge to them. And then the tree itself, the shape of it is smaller, and they have a nice size bowl before they spread out a little bit and have those kind of separate sections to the tree itself as it widens out. And we have the oak tree. So I chose just the bur oak to put here, but oak trees, for some reason, I find it difficult to identify just because of, I think, the variety that we have. So for example, the bur oak has a tall trunk. The bole is very long, and then it's got that more circular shape of its limbs, the growth of its branches and limbs. So the leaf itself is a great way to identify the bur oak because it's got the wavy sides to it. And then the trunk itself is not super unique, but it's got more long, skinny oval scales on it. And it's a little bit deeper. It's not as deep as like a maple tree would be, or a sycamore tree. But the scales are somewhat distinct. Oaks, I tend to think of like the the live oak, where its limbs, the bole is very short and its limbs grow out very aggressively and wide. But it's not a local tree, but that's how I tend to think of oaks, because a lot of oaks will grow wide, not tall. But we have some oaks here that grow tall as well. So that's why I get mixed up, is because I focus mainly on the shapes. And when I think of an oak, I think of a low and a wide tree. But here's a bur oak, because I just wanted to show a different type that's very common here based on the leaf identification. Okay, I think it's the last one I have right now. So this is the beechwood tree. I love beech trees. So I get sad when I see the etchings in them, because they're absolutely gorgeous. They are one of the biggest growing trees too. Like they'll get quite large. If you go to Highland Park or Highland Cemetery, that's a great place to do tree identification, because there's a lot of old protected trees there. And they usually don't have much competition because it's not a forest. So they can grow really big and sturdy. So there is a really beautiful beechwood tree down near the church there, if that's how you'd identify that building. So it's down lower in the Highland Cemetery, but that beech tree, if you want to see a beech tree, is absolutely gorgeous. The trunk of this is the smoothest trunk that you'll see around here, and it's gray. It's a very light gray, super smooth. It might have, if it's younger, it might have some kind of lines that are some horizontal lines going through it, but it's generally just a super, super smooth trunk. And then some of the roots, the beechwood tree, those roots will grow above ground. So the base of the tree is not just going straight into the ground, but it bowls outward. And usually that's why you see people climbing around on beech trees, because they have a lot of roots and scales coming out above the ground, and it's a lot wider than others. So they're very distinct for the height that they get. That trunk, I can identify a beechwood out of any other tree in the wintertime, because it's just so distinct for its bark. And then also the leaves are really pretty, and they have a very, in the sunlight, it's a super thin leaf. So if you looked up into, if you looked from under, it's super light. It's almost like a lime green, and you can see through it, and it's got this awesome texture to it. So beechwoods, I absolutely love. Those are a great starter, one of the great starter trees to identifying. So like I said, I'll definitely add, I'll be sending this out to you next week, because I want to add a little bit more to the description aspect of it, and then also give you a little bit of a guide to where you can find some of these trees if you are kind of adventuring around Rochester. But I'll have that out to you next week. And I'll also we'll be posting the video as well. But let me just stop share. So let me see, this question is beechwood the same as beech tree? Yeah, it is still the same. It's just, I just tend to say beechwood, but it's a beech tree. Yep, it's the same thing. So does anyone have any more questions or just discussion points? If you have a tree you'd like to see in the guide, or an area in Rochester, outside of Rochester, that you think has got some really good trees, you can let me know.
I have a question about, I'm Diane.
Hi.
About if you, like when we were talking about is it the spotted beetle?
The lanternfly, yeah.
Yes. If you are like in a, because I'm very familiar with Powder Mill, because it's close to me, but all the other parks. But if you should see a tree that has some sort of egg sacs on it, do you report it to someone there at the park?
Yeah, I would say definitely tell someone at the park. I know there's probably a phone number somewhere on, I can write that at the end of the thing as well, with the
Mhm.
references for DEC website. I'll look into if they have just like a generic phone number to call. But I think the best bet is at least just telling someone at the park. But yeah,
Mhm.
especially, and then if it's at the park, I would also say you don't have to do this whole scrape it off yourself. That's if like you had a tree
Right,
yourself in your
right,
yard,
yeah.
or yeah, like somewhere in your neighborhood, just to prevent it and get it off quick. But if it's in a park, I would say just let them
Right.
know and they'll take care of it.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. This is very
Yeah.
informative.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Good. Thank
Mhm.
you. Any other questions? So if there's not, like I said, we'll be posting this if you had any other, if you missed anything. If you're interested in the presentation itself, if you just want that as a reference, you can email me as well. It's just abby@impactearthrock.com. I'll write it in here, but you could also just find my email is the one for the education contact. So if you went into the education section, you would find my email as well. But if you did want that, I can send that over to you as well. Yes, Sarah, I agree, more conifers. I need to add some more. I was sad that I only put the one in because I do love them. So I will definitely add a few of those more basic, most common conifers that we see. But yeah, I'll get that out to you guys next week, and I have all your emails, so I'll send that to you. But thank you so much. I'm glad you were able to come tonight and appreciate trees with me too. Good, I'm glad. Okay, have a good night. Enjoy the weekend.
Night.
Thank you.
Bye.
You too.